Everyone, welcome to Manufacturing Hub. This is episode 169. We are finishing up our IIoT theme this week. If you guys are new here, welcome. If you guys have been here before, welcome back. If you are new here, we like to have a fun interactive show. The main platforms that we're streaming and pulling questions and comments from are LinkedIn and YouTube, which is where I imagine most of you guys are watching this from. And if Freestream, our platform, continues to cooperate, we will actually go see your comments and we'll be able to pull them up. So if you guys have questions or comments during this, for Aron, for Vlad, for myself, about IIoT in general, please feel free to go ahead and ask as we go through this. One bit of procedural for everyone. Vlad and I will be off next week for both American 4th of July and Canada Day. Vlad never remembers, and so I have to go say it out loud over and over. So we will not be live next week. But you guys can catch us the following week, the second week of July. We're talking all about software in manufacturing. Without further ado, everyone, officially welcome to Manufacturing Hub. My name is Dave. This guy up here is Vlad. Again, this is episode 169, and we'd like to welcome our guest, Aron Semle of HighByte, onto the show. Aron, thank you for being here.
My pleasure. Yeah, and you nailed the last name. Nice job.
Thank you. Thank you.
Good. Well done, Dave. Aron, thank you so much for joining us today. I think it's going to be a very interesting conversation. I've mentioned this a little bit off stream. I know that HighByte is mentioned in a lot of different manufacturing conversations that I at least follow. So I've not, fully experienced it myself hands-on, but I do want to ask you a couple of questions throughout this conversation, understand a little bit better, the product, what you guys offer, what kind of problems does it solve, because I've myself experienced them in manufacturing, as we've talked a little bit off stream. That being said, before we dive into those conversations, could you give us a little bit of a background of yourself? How did you get into manufacturing? How did you get into industrial automation? And how did you come to build out HighByte?
Yeah, sure thing. So I started in '08. I graduated computer engineering school out of Maine. So we're based in Portland, Maine. I was out of UMaine Orono. And then started a company called Kepware, which most people in the space are familiar with. So I didn't pick industrial manufacturing like by design. It was more, hey, I'm looking for a job. This seems pretty cool, pretty niche. And then worked with Tony Payne, the CEO now of HighByte. So came in and worked there. So I started my career with like OPC UA and OPC drivers and that kind of stuff. And then in 20, moved in kind of product management from engineering. And then in 20, I think it was 2016, someone will have to fact check me here. We sold to PTC, in which case I moved on to work for PTC. I worked for Howard Heppelman, which was Jim Heppelman's brother, the CEO. So it was an interesting position there. Really great group. Was focused on ThingWorks. Rick Bellata's, if you're familiar with him, his baby, and kind of combining that in Kepware and bringing that to market. And then I briefly left there for a healthcare startup a couple of years back. And then in 2020, joined HighByte as CTO. So back in menu. So I jumped into healthcare. It was fun. You got hugs, didn't get paid a ton, but it was cool to have the impact. But glad to be back in manufacturing. It's just fun. We deal with all kinds of different clients, as you guys know, different customers making stuff, and it's a blast.
Aron, a couple of questions for you, I guess, like tracing back and maybe a bit historically, right? So when you graduated and joined Kepware, what was your maybe impression at the time? Had you known about OPC? Had you known about sort of the industrial space? And maybe what was the transition or learning curve like at the time?
Yeah, it was interesting. So I was doing a bunch of web development back then, like outside of school, working on Ruby on Rails, which is like this new cool
Mhm.
tool back then, and REST interfaces and all this stuff. So I was like playing with that in my spare time. And then I'd go into work and I'd learn OPC. And before I interviewed with Tony, I got a hold of like the OPC DA spec before I came in,
Mhm.
and kind of read through it. So kind of got it like a high level concept of what it was there. And then when I started, obviously dug into it. But I was always amazed back then. At nights, I'd be hacking, doing REST APIs, RESTful services, and JSON. And then I'd come into work and I'd be like, control logics, Alan Bradley, even at IP, and all this like cryptic stuff into OPC. And I'm like, this seems really complicated. Like it's data movement in both cases, but in industrial, we're doing it very differently with different technologies. So it's interesting early in my career to see that and kind of the bridge. And fast forward till now, those worlds are combining, I think, faster than they were definitely back in '08.
Yeah.
Industry
And
slow, but yeah, it's changing. Yep.
I'll make the comment, and I think a lot of the industry, at least like engineers that I talk to, are either electrical or software, right? Which are sort of the two worlds outside of, let's say, computer engineering, which I think combines the two to some extent. So I'm assuming that background also helped you not just be, obviously you can pursue sort of the more like web or app development, but you've probably been also exposed, to assembly languages, to kind of more like computer based architectures that probably helped you in the early days at least.
Yeah, yeah, the lower level stuff, assembly, et cetera. Got that in school. Got the transistors, PNN junctions, and all that stuff. I don't use any of that. I think the only thing I use is the Nyquist theorem now. Sample at twice the frequency at which you need the data to make sure you don't miss any samples. Is the only thing that carried over. But yeah, it was a good blend between computer science and electrical engineering.
Let me ask you about the transition to more of a product based role, right? So I'm assuming at that point in time you had a good vision of where the product was heading, so you had to understand maybe the customers as well. You started to interact maybe with manufacturers. What kind of, I want to say, like challenges at the time had you seen that were, I want to say, like unsolved and worth solving? I'm just curious maybe how those interactions worked with the end users at the time.
Yeah, so I got that opportunity fairly early in my career. It was like 4 or 5 years in. Kepware was growing. I think when I was joined, I was probably in the 20s or early 30s of like employee count, right? And then by the time it sold to PTC, I think we were 120-ish. So I kind of went through that growth cycle, which was really cool. Um, and yeah, I think I got the opportunity to take a pragmatic marketing course, which I think is still around, which is really focused on, okay, empathy for your customers, right? Like go. You might have a good idea; it's a great engineering idea, but like actually go talk to somebody and see if this is useful. And I remember one of the things they talked about in that course, and this is just a side note, but it was Samsung had created a refrigerator with a television embedded in the door of their fridge, right? And it was like, okay, that's cool. It was a lot of engineering to do that, but how many users actually want a refrigerator with a television embedded in the door? Like, is it that practical? Would you just have a
Mhm.
separate TV? So I think that experience was really cool. And then it was a time, it was a transformative time in industry too. You had all these at the time we called them IoT platforms coming in that
Mhm.
wanted access to industrial data. Kepware was in a unique position where they had connectivity to all the PLCs. They're providing data to HMIs over OPC and historians, but you could get that data up to IoT platforms. So engaging with customers, engaging with prospects, that was the early days of we call it the IoT gateway, which was like an MQTT client that we put into Kepware that could send tag data up to these IoT platforms like ThingWorks. So it was an interesting time to really understand, but it was really early, right? To understand like where customers' heads were at with cloud. Some were totally against cloud, some were open to it, some didn't know what it was. So it was a really
Mhm.
interesting time to kind of connect with customers and industry, see where they were.
Which probably changed now, right? But I don't want to ask you that question because I think manufacturing certainly changed in the last like 5 to 10 years. But let me ask you, maybe since you've already mentioned the term, which is IIoT, right? So
Mhm.
Dave and I did an episode where we discussed sort of our, how to say, like definition of IIoT, but without going into that, I wanted to maybe get your perspective. How do you define IIoT, whether that's hardware or software or a combination of the two? Like, what is in your world IIoT?
It's tough. So we coined industrial Internet of Things, right? IIoT was the term back
Mhm.
then. I always wanted to trademark it I squared OT just because I thought that would be cool and geeky, but never got there. Um, it is interesting. Like I actually think about IoT less in the space of industrial now than I probably traditionally I did back then.
Mhm.
The whole like smart connected
Really?
devices, like your refrigerator is going to be talking to your grocery store or whatever. Like that never really materialized out of the IoT space.
Mhm.
LoRa and some of the other protocols are around, like the low bandwidth, like those, but they're not.
Yep.
They haven't been, extremely adopted or a lot in industrial. So I we are industrial IoT. We have connected devices. We always have. We've got PLCs. We
Mhm.
got actuators at the edge. Like we've always been there. But the idea that you would connect those directly up to the cloud, which was pretty prevalent back like 2016,
Mhm.
to me that part has gone away. Maybe that's why I don't consider industrial Internet of Things as prominent as I used to, right? It's like there's layers in between and they're important layers and those are maturing, but it's not like
Mhm.
you're going to connect your PLC directly up to the internet and control it from, you know, Azure AWS.
Oh no, Aaron, you,
Well,
you shouldn't
that's
say that.
debatable.
Let's just Vlad, put your earmuffs on for the previous 15 seconds. Otherwise, the entire conversation will be what would we need to do to be able to control the PLCs from the cloud, which I don't want to do. I want to go dig some more into what you're talking about IIoT, but first, Aron, I think it's really interesting your background, and I want to make sure we can ask one background question of lessons learned. Right? You said that you were in Kepware fairly early. You guys made the sale to PTC, a much larger company, and then right at some point in there was a huge Rockwell influx of capital. As you went from that 20-person company into scaling into those larger companies, are there any kind of lessons learned of growth, or any kind of lessons learned that are helping you now as your current role in HighByte, as you guys are looking to grow and get to more customers?
Yeah, it's a great question. I guess to answer it personally, like going from a
Hmm.
small company where you have a lot of influence, things move fast,
Hmm.
it's efficient, to a much larger company where there's a lot more. And the other thing you realize in the PTC ecosystem, like ThingWorks and Kepware and all those acquisitions were really interesting, but they
Hmm.
weren't their core business, right? So you're
Yep.
kind of like this new startup inside of PT, which was a cool place to be.
Hmm.
But things just move a lot slower, right? There's a lot more people involved, a lot more communication. So for me personally, the biggest takeaway was I'm better, more geared towards the startup, fast moving environment. That's where I enjoy it. Like
Hmm.
maintaining product or kind of work. I think I did more PowerPoint than I've ever done in my life when I was at PTC. And actually, when Tori, one of the founders of HighByte, was like, "Hey, could you come talk to these guys? You know, Dave and Vlad." I'm like, "Do I have to do any PowerPoints?" And she's like,
Hmm.
"No." And I said, "I'm in."
Vlad, maybe that should be our selling point to all CTOs and technical folks that we want to go bring on, is no PowerPoints allowed. Maybe that is the missing link to go get more and continuing interesting guests as we come to this, is no PowerPoints allowed. Maybe that'll be the sub bullet of Manufacturing Hub into the future. But no, Aron, you said that to us the first time we met, and I just had a huge laugh. And again, we want to thank you for coming on to discuss this. With you as your CTO role, and HighByte, you guys are using a term, or maybe coining a term, industrial data ops. Can you tell us a little bit more as to what industrial data ops is?
Yeah, so HighByte was founded in 2018 by Tori, Tony, and John Harrington.
Hmm.
So they're the three founders. They came from Kepware, right, as well.
Hmm.
So they kind of understand the space. So they started using that term back in 2018 when nobody knew what it was. And
Yes.
I would come. I joined in 2020, and I would come in, and John would be in the other room talking to customers endlessly on the phone about industrial data ops and what it means to put context around data. Like same conversation over and over again.
Yes.
And we would get it done with a day. I'm like, John, how are you doing it? Like, how do you keep going? And now fast forward to today, and there's market pull, right? There's an
Hmm.
understanding and more understanding around industrial data ops is more people are talking about it. So really what industrial data ops is data ops as a practice is an IT discipline, right? So it's, I've got to, in the cloud or wherever, I've got to move data from one SQL server to another. There's tools to do that. I've got to move data from SQL to my data lake. There's tools to do
Hmm.
that and process. MuleSoft, for example, is a tool that's used in those spaces. So it's kind of that same discipline, but it's applying that to the manufacturing space where it's different. So why can't you use like MuleSoft in manufacturing? And the biggest reason is I somewhat laugh, but manufacturing is a mess in terms of our data, right? I said this to you guys, like people that come in industry and like, what's the difference? Why are you using all these proprietary tools and technologies in manufacturing? What's the difference? And it's like, well, go walk in a data center. Okay, go to a data center tour, and
Hmm.
now go do a tour in a manufacturing facility. Take notes,
Hmm.
come back and talk to me about what you saw that was different. It's significantly different, right?
Hmm.
And the data strategy in manufacturing has never really existed. It's existed, but beyond the scope of the actual plant that it's in, not really, right? We know we need to wire PLCs, we need ladder logic and control of the equipment. We need to bring that back into an HMI to have local visualization. Sometimes we're going to have an historian, but beyond that, there was no strategy. So
Hmm.
you think 10 years ago, a controls engineer, system integrator goes in there, wires up the machine, takes that tag, gets it into the HMI, and says, I'm done. I'm going on my lunch break, right? I'm good.
Hmm.
We're good here. Fast forward 10 years later, that tag, that data point suddenly needs to be globally recognizable, right? Like in the scope of the entire enterprise, that suddenly matters, but it was never intended to do that. So when you look at how historically how we tried to solve this in 2016, we said, okay, we're going to take this data, these tag data that we have in the OPC server, and we're going to send it up to the cloud, right? And all we're going to have is a tag name, and we're just going to jam data into the cloud, and then someone's going to figure out what that data is and what it means when it gets up there. Turns out
Hmm.
that's a terrible strategy. So you took you took a tag name, you took the data as far away from the source as it can be, and then you
Hmm.
created you told somebody to put context around it. That's really difficult, right? So in manufacturing, our data is a mess. What DataOps is how do we create the process and the tools and the technology to allow a team. My vision is it's a team of like 6 people for a company that has like 50 facilities, right? 50 sites, a fairly large,
Mhm.
can with the right tooling deploy software at the edge that can be used by the manufacturing facility to put context around their data and then move that data in an organized way out of the facility into the cloud or whatever infrastructure they need to enable use cases. So it's all use case driven, right? And that team of 6 people has a backlog of use cases they're working on. They can go in and quickly enable those. If one of those use cases has value in a facility, they can quickly replicate that across other facilities, even if the infrastructure, machines, equipment in that facility are different, right? It's a doable thing. It's a scalable thing to do, which today is really hard. Um,
Mhm.
and I always said like what we're doing in industrial data ops is we're trying to reduce the cost of change to zero, because once you can model data at the edge and get it into the cloud and someone can use it for machine learning, visualization, whatever, the first thing they're going to do is say, I want to change. I want additional data. I want to scan it faster.
Mhm.
That's the problem you need to go solve, right? How do you enable that at scale, those kind of changes rapidly with a small
Mhm.
team? That's a
Aaron,
long-winded answer, but we can peel it back.
I do want to peel it back a little bit, right? So I think, it's important to recognize that maybe not everyone in the audience has experienced those, let's say, challenges or problems.
Mhm.
So if I could ask you maybe what are some common needs as to why, let's say, a business now wants to pull that data, right? For someone who's been, let's say, connecting that PLC to an HMI or even to a SCADA system that's at the server level and has been saying, well, like we're running, right? At the end of the day, we're getting product out the door. Why should we now care about collecting any of that data at the enterprise level or even merging them from different sites?
Yeah. So the first one that'll come up, like kind of in the early days of like, you'll see more often is just site by site comparison, and that's usually coming
Mhm.
from corporate. That like, hey, we have these sites, they produce tractors, they produce the same tractor. This one's more efficient than this one. Give us data to go figure that out. Allow us to view that in real time. That is a use case. It is a valid one. But I'll give you a better example. So we have a customer. AGVs, autonomous guided vehicles, are like
Mhm.
ubiquitous now. They're everywhere, right? I was in Sam's Club the other day, and they had one like floating around the aisles, and it was funny
It
watching
does
people
so
like try to
much.
interact with the thing, like moving their cart. But so we had a customer that has AGVs. So these things, it's in a warehouse and it's moving, it's
Mhm.
moving equipment around. And these things like your Roomba would just get stuck in a corner somewhere, right? And like technically that's production downtime, right? It's just stuck in the corner.
Mhm.
And then somebody in the facility would be walking around and they would see it and then go, fix it, get it back going again. So that was the problem, right? So how do they use DataOps to solve that? Well, one of the challenges is those AGVs are not connected into the local SCADA system. They don't have like an integration to connect into, like, let's say Ignition that they were using.
Mhm.
So what they did, and this is a really simple use case, but HighByte in this case is already installed. They're able to do is connect over a REST interface to that AGV uh, on site, right? Pull its position data, pull that into the cloud, write a quick Lambda that tried to figure out, okay, has this thing not moved in a period of time based on its schedule? Yes or no? When there is an error, they can then use the DataOps platform to push the error notification back down to the factory into the HMI and generate an alert that says, hey, this AGV is stuck in the corner. Someone go get it. Right. So the cool thing about it is that once they solved this use case and they used DataOps technology to do it, they used the cloud to do the logic. They had multiple facilities that had the same problem, right? And once they've deployed that in one, now they can just scale. They found a use case, they enabled it quickly, they found value, and then they scale that out across facilities using the same tooling. So that's a strange example, but it's an example of, if you take this data ops strategy, what you can do is quickly enable use cases, find ones that have value,
Mhm.
and then drive those across your enterprise. Whereas today, it's like one site's doing it. There's no way to scale it, even if they found a hacked solution locally.
Mhm.
So it's those kind of integrations that I think are the most interesting.
That's really awesome. And just so I confirm, I guess, the architecture, right? So I've not deployed AGVs myself, but I'm assuming the AGV has an IPC on board that publishes some data to, let's call it, a local server for
Mhm.
like coordinates purposes, or like you said, maybe like a XYZ location of the robot, and then you can ingest that data into an app that's running at the edge, and then send it to the cloud for understanding what the status is, and then send a confirmation to, let's say, like someone's cell phone, email, or whatever the notification like medium is. In this case, it was Ignition. You mentioned they already had an installation, so it could be like robots stuck for like whatever, and there's a counter of minutes, seconds, hours, right? So you need to go and address that essentially.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And it's a little worse because in this case they had three or four. I think they had four AGV vendors that all
Mhm.
had different interfaces into the AGV. Some did spark plug,
Always.
some were REST, one had a Modbus interface.
Ooh.
So the correct tooling at the edge was able to cover up that abstraction as well. So like you didn't care by the time you got it into the cloud, it all looked the same regardless of the transport at the edge.
Yeah. And that goes back to the problem, you've mentioned in the industrial space where we have so many protocols, it seems, on top of also the IT protocols, right? But ultimately, there's a saying, I think we have, 20 protocols, let's create a new one to combine all of them. Now we have 21 protocols, right? I think that's
Right.
the reality. And that's not even also adding in the complexity of maybe, like you mentioned, data contextualization, which is different across vendors, different across regions where the machine has been made. So I certainly understand why you need to consolidate that in order to then scale across different sites. So I think that's a really good example. Dave?
Absolutely. I agree with that. I think it's a great example. And I would think the majority of people who are listening who have worked with these applications agree with what you're saying, Aaron, right? Like they agree that we need contextualization, ideally before we push a whole bunch of tags with no naming structure that's actually structured up to the cloud, and then basically can't do anything with it because we don't have that contextualization. And I agree. I've also seen a shift towards people agreeing that that needs to happen. In reality, and implementation wise, what are you seeing? How are you seeing kind of this happen? Is it, a group starts working with a DataOps tool and they see some success and they go push it up corporately? Are you seeing corporate understanding the need to have this contextualization and push it down? How are you seeing this being rolled out to a variety of manufacturers?
Yeah, it's most successful when you have IT and OT involved at the table, like together, right? I can give you plenty of examples where it started on the IT side, and OT was like, "Get out of here!" We're not we're not
Mhm.
adopting your tool set. For example, maybe IT tried to push MuleSoft and it got onto the factory floor, and they're like, "This is
Yep.
an IT tool that doesn't integrate with systems X, Y, and Z." Or I've been in the other case where we've been in long engagements with OT players that start out with UNS Spark Plug, and like we're
Hmm.
helping them go through multiple levels of brokers, and then finally the data ends up in Azure Blob Storage, and you say, "Okay, now what are we going to do?" And they go,
Hmm.
"We don't know." And it's like, okay, we just did all that integration effort, and we don't even know how we're going to use the data yet.
Hmm.
So it's better if both are involved. The other challenges we'll see around contextualization is people can over
Hmm.
rotate on contextualization, right? And
Hmm.
so what they'll do is, especially on the OT side, they'll start and create almost like an academic project of, well, I need to completely contextualize my entire plant. I'm going to build out an ISA 95 hierarchy, every motor, every conveyor, every
Hmm.
asset. I'm going to perfectly model, and they'll spend a month to a year kind of coming up with this what we call a data model, right? And
Hmm.
then they'll finally implement it somewhere, publish data to the cloud to some business unit that needs the data.
Hmm.
They'll look at the data and go, this is good, but we need this, or we need this, or change this. And it's like,
Hmm.
okay, that's probably not the best solution either. So
Yep.
it's best when there's IT and OT involved, and it's best when it's use case driven. So what I
Yeah.
mean by use, like take the AGV, that's a use case. That is a real problem we have in the factory.
Hmm.
If we wire up some data and try it out, there's potential value there. And try to reduce the cost of doing that wiring and testing on the use case to near zero, so that if you finally get the data to the cloud of the business unit, like this use case was useless, this scrap reduction thing you thought was useful is not,
Yep.
okay, throw it away and try the next nine, because one of
Yes.
them that you find is useful is going to unlock, who knows, millions of dollars in savings. So it's best if you have ITOT involved. Some of the challenges is around the ROI conversation. Like business
Hmm.
will come in and say, well, we need ROI benefit, or, we need ROI right away to even begin this project. And it's our take on that. It's understandable. It's a business, right? And to start,
Hmm.
hopefully it doesn't cost you tens of millions of dollars to try to do this. But really you're trying to find those early use cases that you can test and build out the infrastructure, the data ops infrastructure piece by piece while you're going, right? So don't try to
Hmm.
build the whole thing out like from the get go with no use case. We see a lot of failure happen because of that.
Let me ask you maybe a follow up to Dave's question. I think
Hmm.
more on the like org structure and who's involved in these projects. And I think it's, at least like from my experience, important to recognize that the technical people are not always involved in understanding what the opportunities are, and those that are don't always understand what's possible with data, right? So
Hmm.
the question for you, Aaron, maybe is, how would you suggest, let's say, let's call it a operations manager or operations director, maybe identify some of the ways we can leverage data to solve certain problems where currently we are not, right? Because I think it's also, obviously you need to put a dollar amount to what the problem is, but you also need to know, hey, this is possible to be solved if we collect the right data and we send it to the right people. So it is kind of like a catch 22. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on that side.
It is hard, yeah. So I mean, the truth of it is that the people in your factory, like Frank or Sue, who have run the machine for 10, 15 years,
Hmm.
they know the most about that production in your business. Like, you can go up to them and say, "What's wrong? Where's the value?" And they will likely answer. And they're not, like, to your point, Vlad, they're not going to answer in technical terms. They're not going to be like, "Well, if we could scan the pressure at, sub millisecond or whatever." They're not going to say that, but they're going to say, "When this thing starts to sound loud 15 minutes later, this part breaks, and this is why." Right. And so if you can start to facilitate, one of the cool things about this, our more mature customers, when this process is in place, you, because of that feedback loop of like trial and error, you start to facilitate a culture around this, where if you enable people in the factory to be able to come up with use cases, again, they don't know the data piece, they don't necessarily know all the technical bits, but they know the process. If they can articulate that to somebody that can actually take it and do something with it and implement it, it creates this feedback loop of like innovation in the factory. You become like almost citizen developers, right? Like, oh, I have
Hmm.
this idea, hey, we can try it out. Whereas if this infrastructure is not in place, nothing, nothing's going to change. No one's going to do anything. So, but it is a cat and mouse. So you need leadership that kind of understands that hey, this is a bit of an experimentation, and I know the ROI will come. But I really want to empower my business units and IT to be able to find these use cases quickly and scale them. Like, that's what I'm going for. But it is a challenge depending on. That's what I say when like companies come in and their first thing is, well, we just want to compare site A to site B.
Yep.
It's like, well, have you talked to anybody at site A or site B? Like, are you just going to do this from the corporate tower and think it's going to make a difference? Because it's probably not, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's, look, I didn't expect a, how to say, like a very sort of like black or white answer for that question either,
Hmm.
because it is, I think, like very complex. Different groups approach it differently. I've just, like I said, I don't have a good answer either. I just know that groups really struggle, even if, let's say, they set up all the data pipelines and they sort of get, the OE, sort of the MES level metrics right. I think it's still, there's that point where maybe they need an external resource that comes in and
Hmm.
shows them what is possible and what can be done. That's why, like, I wrestle with that a lot, right? Because internally I think it's hard without having seen some of these use cases to bring them in. But
Hmm.
anyways, that's just my perspective. Dave, thoughts?
I said I would agree with that. And as Aaron was telling us about both technical and non-technical people going and kind of building out some of these use cases in the HighByte Intelligence Hub, Vlad and I were a combination of this is a really good idea, we love this, and just absolutely terrified at the fact that some non-technical people would be going out building it. I'll let the listeners at home kind of in their minds imagine who had which faces. I feel like we both had the faces, maybe just at different points in time. But no, so I really like that, and I completely agree, Aaron, that it is very much application and use based. You're not going to find a ton of value just comparing site A to site B, especially because all of the time and effort and work it's going to take in order to go build site A and then build site B, much less go attempt to compare them. And hopefully we've normalized or contextualized all of the information because there is about a 0% chance the tags are one to one across sites. Let me go ask the question about machine data versus non machine data or maybe human data. Can you tell us what you're seeing, what you're experiencing? Maybe talk a little bit about data governance, please.
Yeah. So I always say three types of data in the factory. There's machine data, there's like MES,
Mhm.
transactional data, and then time series historian data, which is machine data over time. But I think there's more than that, right? If you look at some of our use cases, like, yeah, we'll use machine data averages, but then we'll pull quality data from some, moving on a cart quality system in the factory that outputs CSV files to an FTP server, right? And you've got to mix those data points, or it's like chicken scratch notes that someone wrote down and then suddenly enters into the HMI for like a failure downcode reason kind of thing. So there is a need. It's not just machine data, right? So if your IoT strategy or your industrial strategy is like just get machine data into the cloud, you're missing a good portion of the context that goes around that information. Um, so yeah, I can tell you all the customers that we have scraping CSV files, and I'm amazed at how much our file connectors are used to pull context. Um, and one thing I was thinking, this is a little tangential, but the use case stuff and like so everyone, people come to us and like, what are the top use cases, and they want
Yeah.
to hear things like scrap reduction, energy monitoring, like high level stuff, right? But really, like the AGV one I brought up, the really interesting ones and the valuable ones are like the ones that are really specific to the company and what they're
Yep.
producing, right? That
Mhm.
save the value. And I remember a story like back when I was at PTC, 3D printing was like becoming a big thing. You
Mhm.
know, so PTC had acquired some resources around that. We were doing demos of like 3D printed exhaust manifolds and how you could make it way more efficient and all this. And I'm talking to customers. I think it was a Toyota plant. I'm like, how are you guys using 3D printing? He's like, one of the guys is like, well, I 3D printed this little plastic part that I can jam into the seat where like the seat back thing goes, so that while I'm doing my checks, I just jam that in, so this I don't have to wait for the seat to go all the way back while I'm doing the other checks. And by the time I get there, the seat's all the way back and I can get in the car and do the rest of the checks. And it's like, okay, so like that is valuable. How do you put
That is
ROI
valuable.
on that? But that's a use of the technology that no 3D
Yep.
printing person was like, oh, there's the value. So I'm big on like you've got to enable people to innovate with the technology, and we see that once that culture is in place. But that's a funny story. I remember back then just being like, there's a disconnect between 3D printed manifold and what that what that person
Yes.
was using. Yeah.
I a couple of weeks back was at like an R&D facility, and they were metal 3D printing manifolds and other things. And depending upon how hot it was at the various inlet and outlet points, they actually went to go change the metal makeup so that they could, for the majority of it, print on the less expensive titanium or metals, and then only have the more expensive super high temp on particular points. But as you go look at that, there is so much R&D, so much data analysis that goes to get to the point of we can print it and test it before the fact that it's costing hundreds or thousands of dollars to print each one. So I agree. There are lots of like really cool applications like that, but it's like 1/10 of groups would actually be able to use that. The rest of it is maybe health and safety violations. I'm just slamming this piece of plastic in the seat. So eventually it goes all the way back. No, I like that. What are your thoughts on that, Vlad?
I would say, look, maybe that's also how to say like the downfall of certain trade shows, because yes,
Hmm.
you get the wow, like superficial, but I guess like cool in sight applications, but ultimately if you want to learn, I think the not necessarily the innovative but like creative, I guess, ways that people are applying some of these technologies, you need to talk to the practitioners, right? And
Hmm.
that's why, we're bringing you on the podcast so that we can ultimately explore some of these more interesting use cases versus, what you would see in person on a trade show, which also has its place, right? But I think they're more like for the masses and maybe easier to explain, and the architectures are not as complex. But no, absolutely, Aaron. I think, look, if I can maybe like drill down just a little bit more, right? So you mentioned maybe CSV files, you mentioned quality. Are there any other like interesting use cases of non-machine data, right? And as someone who has a ton of like PLCs behind me, I'm obviously the first guy to say I mostly work with machine data, but maybe what are some of the other points maybe for manufacturers to think about when they look at the processes that are not coming from like PLC sensors, etc., into some of these data aggregation systems.
Yeah, so like MES is the other one that's common, right? So pulling like manufacturing execution systems, so work orders, what are they bill of materials, that kind of stuff can get pulled in through there. ERP not as much. Usually smaller manufacturers maybe, but most of that stuff is managed in the cloud, and you'd pull it into Snowflake and merge it with like the machine data. We have had some interesting applications around planning, right? So like HR systems and just like trying to plan resource in the factory, who's working where, like mixing that with machine data and uptime to try to figure out. I don't know the real intent of that. Maybe it's like, hey, production's down when these set of people are in in the facility, that kind of stuff. Like, uh, um, but it is interesting. You can't, machine data alone, unless you're doing like really isolated machine learning stuff. Like we see a lot in vision systems for quality analysis. Like that's very common these days. So we'll move not videos, because you can't do that. You can't really do that, but pictures, right, through like MQTT brokers to be then analyzed up in the cloud using ML and then routed back. So that's a lot of times that's related to quality control. A few cases where it's like heat, trying to detect, like thermal cameras trying to detect heat efficiencies, or like pipes heating up and that kind of stuff. Um, so it kind of runs the gamut. It is still a majority machine data, but I'm trying to think if like sensors on people too, like body location sensors, like where people are in the factory for safety reasons. If
Mhm.
someone were having an incident, so we've seen a little bit of that as well.
Aaron, let me ask you maybe a dangerously complex question, right? So I don't think we've asked you to kind of describe what HighByte is yet. But instead of asking you maybe what it is today, what is the long-term vision? What is maybe the dream state of manufacturing data ops, if you want to call it that? What do you see in 5 to 10 years in terms of possibilities with data in manufacturing?
Yeah, so I think, in my opinion, this is like future, right? I think the industry is headed towards what I would call, this is kind of a loaded term, but like an edge data lake, right? So I think
Okay.
we've seen companies, a few large pharma companies, try to go completely cloud, right? And
Hmm.
say, hey, we're going to actually have very little edge infrastructure. We're going to connect directly everything to the cloud, HMI, everything's running up there, and just rely on SLA, and our backup fiber and all that to make sure that we never lose connectivity.
Zero
Any
backups on the edge? Not even
anyone
back.
I've seen, yeah. So anyone I've seen do that backpedals eventually, right? Because you
Hmm.
will have downtime. So I think, to me, that's proof that that world doesn't. I think cloud will eventually eat manufacturing, but I don't think it's going to do it that way. Uh, so you need edge infrastructure always, where you have the physical equipment. But what I do think is what you'll see is more, and I think HighByte is I think an early generation of this, where we're providing some of those ETL like capabilities at the edge and the process to scale that and all that. But I think what it ultimately turns into is kind of like an edge data lake. So it's like I have a data lake at the edge that I can deploy and manage from the cloud, but it all runs at the edge local to the site. And I can do data storage, I can do data movement, I can do ETL contextualization at scale at the edge, and then I can control my data pipelines in and out of the factory. And I call it edge data lake because I think it's going to leverage a lot of the cloud technologies, Kubernetes, Docker, that you see in cloud today. Like there's no reason you couldn't use those deployed at the edge with the right infrastructure. And that's ultimately where I think the industry is going to end up in 5 to 10 years. Everyone's like, CTO, all right, CTO in manufacturing, how do you know what's coming? It's like, well, the honest truth is manufacturing is usually 5 to 10 years behind IT. So all you really got to do is look at IT and go, okay, in 5 to 10 we'll be there. You're kind of cheating on the test a little bit. That's not one for one, right? But you can look at
Yep.
VMware, Ethernet, you can look at Docker, Kubernetes today, and
Hmm.
you see the trends.
Let me ask you, I guess, for someone who, like, I understand what a data lake is, but someone who has not heard that term or maybe is not as used again to data ops in a general sense, how do you define or how would you describe maybe the architecture of a data lake?
Yeah, so generally you like Snowflake is an example of this. They would consider themselves a data. They probably would consider themselves more than data lake. Because a few years back, I went to a DataOps conference in Boston, and the amount of terms they throw out, data lake, data lake house, data warehouse, it's like it's mind numbing as a technologist to be like, this is just insane. Uh, so, but data lake in general, right? Think of it as mass scalable storage in the cloud. You're generally landing like fairly contextualized data. Like you're not landing S3 in AWS isn't quite like this. You can land anything you want, but you're not going to land garbage and then try to make sense of it.
Hmm.
You land like semi-structured data, and then you're able to query that at scale, right? And then provide ETL tools kind of in and out of that. Uh, that's the general way to think. It's definitely more flexible than, say, like a process historian that just stores time series data, as an example, right? It can store, data lakes in general can store time series or SQL-like contextual data. Um, but it's essential. It's what everyone's shooting for, right? Central repository of data, efficient storage,
Hmm.
fairly inexpensive, the ability to transform, manipulate, and get it out. Um,
And I think the other, I guess, like term or I guess the onion that I want to unpeel is the edge part, right? So I think the three of us, I would assume, agree that there needs to be an edge device or there needs to be whatever that's a server, whatever that's a data aggregator, a data buffer, what is maybe like the optimal solution, right? And you mentioned it can run obviously Docker, Kubernetes, so it can be deployed. It can be, the software can be destroyed. There's replicas running on it. But in a general sense, what do you expect to have at the edge that cannot be achieved, with the architecture that you've described, which is in the cloud, and you're just directly sending that data over? What would you be doing at the edge as a manufacturer or an end user?
Yeah, so you would have edge infrastructure, you'd have compute right at the edge. There's certain like Hive sells them. There's different companies that kind of do this. It's like an edge compute platform that can run
Mhm.
Docker Kubernetes workloads, right? So, but you'd host that in your facility next to your cabinet or somewhere else. I mean, it's kind of funny. Like data centers are coming back. Like I don't know if you're paying attention to like the broader IT ecosystem, but there's a lot of people questioning like, should I be using cloud for this? Is it less
Mhm.
expensive to actually put this in the cloud, or should I just spend the capital expense on a nice server and rack and host it locally? So there's this kind of this movement back away from cloud. And I think
Mhm.
manufacturing, because we need stuff at the edge as well, will benefit from that. And you'll see this edge infrastructure, maybe not quite a data center,
Yep.
but that infrastructure at the edge.
You don't have to sell me on buying my own servers, but yeah, yeah. Dave, what are your
I think we've made it 7 days, so 0 episodes in between talking about Vlad servers on Manufacturing Hub. So thank you for continuing the trend of 0 weeks since discussing Vlad servers and when does Vlad need to go buy more servers. But no, I think it's interesting. I also have seen, especially with the lack of availability of the servers, a number of groups try to go to the cloud for a variety of things, again with kind of lack of availability of servers during the pandemic, and most of them have either pulled back or in process of pulling back to have more edge compute and edge solutions for all of the reasons we've discussed. SLAs are great, but if you're during that catastrophic downtime for the internet provider or for the data center, and data centers are normally not the issue, then you are machine down, factory down, which is always a really bad and expensive situation, right? Easily hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars for those issues that I have personally seen and witnessed, and it takes approximately zero of those to more than pay for putting servers on the edge at your own facility. So I think it's interesting. I certainly think that we have seen the maybe full scale transformation of no, I'll never put anything in the cloud, to oh my goodness, cloud storage and cloud compute is so cheap. Let me push everything or nearly everything to the cloud, back to some sort of equilibrium. And I
Yeah.
agree. I think that in the future, we will see more people either for control or for uptime or for cost or for other reasons have more of have more of a balance, which I think is good. I think that is absolutely where we need to be.
And
Let me go ask.
AI is the interesting curveball into all of
Okay.
that, right? Like if
Mhm.
uh, contextualization at the edge, making this information more human readable, human understandable, obviously benefits
Yeah.
AI. We're in a bit of a bubble around the whole LLM AI thing. You can feel, everyone I think can feel that, but it's here to stay, right? Part of it's real. And then there's the question of, okay, when you start to look at like operator assistance and where those workloads could run potentially, right? Like an operator steps up to a line and says, hey, how's this thing running today? And it comes back and says, oh, this bearing looks a little hot. The last time it was hot, this happened. Can you go check it
Mhm.
out? Operator checks it out, responds back with some feedback. Uh, I think that's also the future. It'll be interesting if
Mhm.
those workloads can run locally and what the hardware would
Yeah.
be required or their cloud. So that's, I don't know where that fits out in the infrastructure play, but it'll be interesting to see.
I agree. I think it will be interesting, and I think it'll be a combination of both on edge, on prem, but also in the cloud solutions that we will see, and what we're going to have to see when it comes to a variety of those things.
Yeah.
I was gonna say, and I guess I think it's a good transition, first of all, to maybe talk a little bit about AI and what's happening and how it's impacting manufacturing. But my perspective, at least, Aaron, and I want you to chime in on this, is I think that in manufacturing, it's still too early to apply a lot of these models, right? I see still manufacturers of the, maybe the highest advancements when it comes to, let's call it, manufacturing readiness, still struggle with getting that data contextualized and storing it in a location that makes sense, and being able to even, again, like based on that context, like understand something as simple as, this is motor 25 of line 3 of, facility X, and that's going to have an impact of, on the
Mhm.
flow meter that's collecting data 3 feet down. So I think it's still too early, and although there's a lot of excitement, and I think there's a lot of people testing things in,
Mhm.
R&D facilities and on test benches, I still think that we still have a lot of infrastructural problems to solve before we can really leverage anything meaningful. And that's just my perspective.
100%.
I don't know if you
No,
have
I
thoughts.
100% agree. Yeah, yeah. I mean, over a year ago when it first came out, ChatGPT, everyone's like,
Mhm.
"Well, aren't we just going to push our tags to the cloud and then LLM's going to figure out how to put the context around them?" And I'm like, I mean, you play with it for an hour and you're like, "No, that's not like like a really intelligent human in the cloud
Mhm.
can't figure this out. So what's LLM going to do?" So yeah, I agree. I think we have to do that work regardless. I think that work enables those use cases in the future, which is really
Mhm.
interesting. Yeah.
Dave, what are
Do
your
you
thoughts?
guys?
I know
I'll
you've
ask you guys a question. Do you use AI more or less than you did 6 months ago?
Ooh, Vlad, you want
I'll
to go
go first. I
first?
guess I'll go first. So I certainly try things a lot more than I used to 6 months ago in different ways, right? So obviously we do some content with Dave, but then I also try to
Mhm.
process data in certain ways. I find I can learn things a lot faster, whether they're right or wrong. I then have to maybe do more work to figure that out. But I
Mhm.
certainly try to use whether that's ChatGPT or Claude a lot more than I used to. And at the beginning I was extremely skeptical. Now I feel I'm a lot less so, right? I think it's
Okay.
changing certain workflows. I think we don't know which workflows they're going to impact very positively yet, right? So
Sure.
that's why
Yeah.
I guess I'm part of being trying things as well. But I'm also I think there's a lot of debates going on how the more proprietary data is going to feed
Mhm.
into these LLMs, right? And what I mean by that is, let's say you have a facility that collects a ton of this data that wants to apply a model. Well, that's another use case for sort of these edge solutions because they can technically keep it on prem
Yeah.
versus if you just use a common API that is going to currently, at least in the current state, consume all the data. And if there's no legislature to prevent that, it becomes very questionable, at least for me, for a lot of the manufacturers that to the point of cloud didn't even want to put the data in the cloud in the first place because they were like,
Mhm.
we're super
Yes.
worried about the data getting lost.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Mhm.
So
Yeah. Having a walled garden and then determinism too in the answers, or like being able to
Yes.
like it gets better over time and doesn't hallucinate. I think are two of the big critical things in our space. But yeah,
exactly.
I
Absolutely.
agree.
I would say on my side, probably more, but on the probably more using AI side, it is a lot of it is unintentional, right? Like especially on search engines and things like that. Lots of times when I am on Google, like even if it's just normal Google, some percentage of the time it will come up with the Google Gemini, which is what I think they're calling it now, answer. And sometimes it's maybe I trust this, but maybe I also scroll down to go look at some of those sources. So I'd say unintentionally, I'm probably seeing it more, but I feel like the more unintentionally I see it, the more maybe I distrust just kind of like open to everything AI.
Totally. Yeah.
Hank, one of the longtime viewers of the show, posted that he was going on vacation and he posted a picture of his dog, and I forget what he named what he named the dog. I would have to go look, but I sent a picture to Vlad because the LinkedIn AI was like, go learn what this does in manufacturing, and I'm like, it's a picture of a dog. AI doesn't really have it right, so like that's one of those unintentionally. But I feel like it's also there are more intentional use cases, right? There are workflows that I find work well, and lots of those workflows are I'm going to continue to use and will use more. But lots of the we can go draw pictures for you. I'm not sure if I've ever wasted more time trying to get the AI, and for our podcast listeners, I'm using like air quotes of AI to go draw me a picture of what I want, inputting thousands of characters of text in order to go get whichever tool this is to draw a picture of what I want, to be so disappointed, right? Like it's still absolutely cannot
Yeah.
write words. I'm like, draw me a map of the United States and label the states. and it's like some combination of like gibberish and maybe Cyrillic and maybe like some Asian characters, and I'm like, it's not even like just unlabel a map, and I ask it to give me the map unlabeled, and it can't. Right? It in fact changes the state shape. So there are some things that it's I feel like we are a ways off, but I would say on industrial application wise, I think it's very interesting because lots of groups are willing to spend money to go R&D some of this early. I was having a conversation with a group who was, I don't know, low to mid nine figures into a variety of artificial intelligence testing kind of across what they're doing for their brands, right? Hundreds of millions of dollars into this. And they certainly see that this is the future. And I'm having enough of these conversations to know that there will be a lot of R&D money spent, and there'll be a lot of these tools that we will go kind of deploy out. If we ever get to the, you know, going and uploading tags and it can contextualize the tags or tell us things to do, I don't really know, right? Like for me, that is not the big win when it comes to, for me, that is not the big win when it comes to artificial intelligence and a variety of things coming from that. We've got a comment from Spencer talking about how he scrolls past the large language models generated LinkedIn posts. He still believes in authenticity. I also agree. I've tried it a couple of times, having it rewrite on LinkedIn or some of these other platforms, and I've never been more disappointed in anything in my entire life. I'm like, you guys are fed millions of these, and you literally cannot put together a good sentence.
Yeah, we're hiring. If someone gives me a cover letter, the first thing I do is run it through an AI check to see if it was generated by AI. If it was, I won't even read the resume. I'm like, if you can't take the 10 minutes to write a cover letter, that's you.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's an interesting. I'll make the last comment maybe on my side. It's an interesting transition where I think the non-AI skills are going to be valued even more so with everyone sort of defaulting to AI. That's what I kind of like the comment I will leave. And that could be across like different industries as well, right? That could be in software generation. I
Mhm.
think the low hanging fruit will obviously get replaced by AI, but I think the software engineers that are very
Mhm.
solid on the technical side will only become more valuable, despite, what we saw kind of like last year and this year in terms of like layoffs. I think the profession of engineer will not be sort of like impacted as much as people seem to think.
Either that or I'll become a plumber or a electrician. I think that's my backup.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
because AI will not take away
Can't
electrical work.
can't get me.
Um,
Yep.
if you're willing to go bust your knuckles going and
Right.
running power when someone doesn't have power, you will undoubtedly always have a job.
Have a job.
Aron, this is super interesting. I guess we've got time to ask you one or two more questions, but I want to talk about, what can be done with data. There are so many different layers of data. Maybe you have a couple of examples that we can talk about, and then also talk about information at scale when you're dealing with enterprise clients. So maybe you've got a couple of examples. Maybe you could tell us your thoughts around that, please.
Yeah, the biggest scale clients we have are clients with mass historians, right? So the
Mhm.
challenges are you've had Pi, OSI Soft, now Aviva, for decades, and we've got terabytes, petabytes, whatever of data in these systems, and we want to get all of all of that into the cloud. Again, now that's not our. We can help customers do that. It's not necessarily our recommendation from a technical perspective. Like, do you really need all of this historian data in the cloud, or do you need
Mhm.
pieces of it, parts of it? Again, use case driven. So um, in terms of scale, like actual volume, that's probably where
Yeah.
we see the most coming out of those historians. um, and what was your second question, Dave? We're
Um,
getting late in the interview. I'm like nodding off, sorry.
no. Aron is over here, man, saying, "Man, I really wish we had a couple of PowerPoint slides to fall back on." No, but it was very much kind of what can be done with data, right? We've got the SCADA layers. We've talked a bunch about the MES and a little about the ERP. We've
Yeah.
talked about cloud computing. Do you have an example, or maybe a couple of examples of maybe fun, interesting applications that you can go ahead and share?
Yeah, so I kind of meant in the AGV case, but a really
Yeah.
common one is so it's not just getting data into the cloud that's
Hmm.
contextualized and usable instantly, right? It's also getting information back down into the factory. So it is data ops, industrial data ops is bi-directional, which I think the more interesting use cases are
Okay.
there, right? So like I'm going to contextualize some data. I'm going to send it out. Like we have, we have a very large customer that's in package distribution, and they have PLCs in their warehouse facility. They have
Mhm.
they've invested in MQTT based sensors that sense like vibration on the conveyor belts, and they also have like the work order information for the packages that are going through the system. And what they're doing is they're gathering that information and then using some machine learning to try to figure out if the motor on the conveyor is going to fail. Because if it does, that conveyor's down and like now we're behind in shipping and this is bad, right? So they do that at scale across 40 or 50 facilities. But what's
Mhm.
interesting again is like you're packaging that data, you're contextualizing it, you're taking it from MQTT, from OPC UA, and then from SQL. That's where the work order information is coming from. You're contextualizing it all, sending it up to machine learning. Machine learning, then if it detects an event, routes that back down into the SCADA system, right? Again, and that's a really important part. Like people think like, oh, you can just notify people via their cell phones via text. I don't know if you know this, but text is not reliable. If you try to notify via text, like you might get it right away, you might get it in 3 hours.
Mhm.
So it's better generally to use the existing systems in the factory to notify the people how they would get any other process alarm as well. To me, those like round trip cases are interesting. I think Vlad, you brought up early when we were talking before the show about like actual control and sending signals down that would change process settings. We don't see that as much yet. Open question as to whether or not that will happen, right? Obviously, there's security concerns there. We did have another customer in the AGV case. There was an interesting piece of like a security piece of like, if this AGV is malfunctioning, should we shut the door? Like, should HighByte send a signal down to the controller to actually like shut the door in the facility? And our recommendation was like, is that hooked into your security system? And they're like, yes.
Mhm.
We should probably not be sending signals to shut doors through your security.
Mhm.
So that was our recommendation. Whether the customer does it or not is up to them. But we're hesitant to get into the control path just because there's liability there, right?
Yep.
So that may change over time, but
And I think that's definitely, that is a big stepping stone to overcome to doing any controls back, from the cloud. I think, the first step that I'm seeing, and maybe tying this to your example of conveyor systems, and maybe obviously I don't have the full context of what the application really is, but I think it would be interesting to see, let's say, if you reduce the speed of a conveyor that is, let's say, like failing or is about to fail, is that going to extend, the life to, let's say, the next maintenance period? You know what I mean? I'm
yeah,
just,
that's
I'm
interesting.
just
Yeah,
so,
Mhm.
so, you know what I mean? Maybe not pull the gun of, let's do the entire control process, the entire PLCs running in the cloud, but let's find these micro use cases where we can play around with these like parameters that come back from the machine learning model and start to tweak certain variables. And again, like the conveyors is one example. I think there's a lot more complex things that can be done on entire like production lines in terms of like machines running like speeds and figuring out like bottlenecks. I think the possibilities are, how to say it, like greater than what we currently are exposed to. I guess like that's how best
sure.
like I would put it.
Yeah,
But foundationally, you need the data to be contextualized and scalable, and you need to be able to add data as you need, right? Because ultimately, and I've told you this off stream, when I was trying to pull additional tags from an existing system, it took weeks to figure that out. So
Mhm.
obviously, by that time, kind of, the priority changes and you go do something else. So it needs to
yeah,
be in a way that makes sense.
Dave.
Absolutely. I will say to our listeners, especially the folks on podcast forum or the rewatchers, every once in a while, Vlad and I just go a little bit off on like this crazy deep tangent that maybe not everyone understands, as Vlad said to begin with. And I know Vlad and I have had hundreds of hours of conversation about the need for data contextualization in the past. And as I'm sitting here and we are like fairly deep in the weeds, if you guys have questions or comments or other things or don't quite understand, please feel free to go ahead and reach out as to if we can answer them or if we'll go pass you over to Aron. We will be more than happy to go ahead and do that. And I just wanted to go throw that out there for anyone who has made it this far and maybe doesn't quite understand exactly what it is that we're talking about. Or I guess I've gotten an aunt that listens and a couple of neighbors, and they're like, "It was a lot of fun, Dave, but we have no idea what you're talking about." So if you guys are in industry or interested in the topic and don't understand what we're talking about, please feel free to go ahead and reach out. We will be happy to go ahead and provide some contextualization for that. Aron, this has been awesome. We want to go ask you the same final questions we ask all of our guests. And I want to go ask maybe about information for enterprise into the future, right? So it's very much predict the future. What do you think the next, and I know we've asked this question a bit on the HighByte side, but from your side, where do you think information looks like on the manufacturing side in the next 3 to 5 years?
Yeah, I think so. In terms of future predictions, I think cloud eats manufacturing eventually. That's not 3 to 5
Hmm.
years, but if you look at Amazon,
Yeah.
Azure, GCP, what they're doing, they're coming into the space pretty hard, investing pretty hard.
Yep.
Uh, in the actual manufacturing side, I do think I've made this prediction like a year ago. I think there's a new protocol that's going to come out of the OPC Foundation. I have no bearing for this really. Recently, there's been some discussions that are interesting, but I do think there's potentially a new generation of protocol that is more kind of blends potentially OPC and MQTT like capabilities where you can plug devices in, they're auto discoverable, makes data
Hmm.
access easier. Might not happen, but I do feel like
Yeah.
something's coming to make that integration easier in the factory, leveraging more modern web technology stuff that has existed for 10 years and is
Hmm.
does things well. Um, so I'm on
Interesting.
record now for that
I
prediction.
I don't know if that, like, in theory, one protocol to rule them all would be absolutely amazing. I don't know if it would make our lives easier or more complex when it comes to actually working with end users. So now we'll have OPC DA, OPC UA, 17 forms of MQTT that none of us can really agree upon. This new one, and we'll still have Modbus and a variations of RS-232 and 485 and all of that floating around on the factory floor.
Yeah.
And yeah, I think one protocol, Vlad and I, when we run down our list of all protocols, have not quite surpassed an entire document. Just kind of listed one after the other yet. So it will be interesting.
I
It will be interesting.
So people bring up the argument, yeah, it's one plus protocol, and now we have more, and I get it. That's a totally valid
Yep.
argument. But the antithesis to that is, what we're supposed to just stick with Modbus then, or should we
Mhm.
should we
No,
not
I,
innovate?
I,
And we're still doing bit flipping and Indian order and all that
I,
craziness.
for me, it's less we can't have more protocols and more on the, how do I say? I think there's a need to go through a modernization process and start cutting out some of the older protocols,
Yeah, that's fair.
if only for ease of use. I think there are lots of people who haven't grown up working on Modbus or the various RSs, and they go look at this, and especially if they're not from industry, and they're like, you guys are absolute maniacs for needing like 17 dongles connected to actually now plug into a MacBook in order to work. I feel like
Yeah.
this would be the appropriate time for Vlad to lift up his 17-pound laptop that still has like 20 ports on both sides. Or are you using that to stream, Vlad?
I'm using that to stream.
Oh, let's
All I'm
ask
missing
Vlad.
is a
Vlad,
parallel
It's
port.
reliable.
You know what I mean?
yes.
I'm missing that laptop with a full parallel, like
Oh,
full pin port.
Vlad, Vlad. I guess we'll ask you before we continue with Aron. Do we need another protocol?
That's a tough question. I don't know. I
Okay.
look, I think like in my stance on protocols is they're not that complicated, and I think you can extract data from any protocol device whatsoever, obviously given the knowledge, the time, the money. And
Hmm.
so I think at some point you need a concentrator that doesn't really care what it talks to, which many hardware providers already like give. So ultimately, that single concentrator can then talk a single protocol towards the cloud, and that could be again like that's your edge device. So I don't think they're not as problematic as people sometimes make them seem. That's my opinion.
Okay. And so Aron is on record of we need one more protocol, and Vlad is on record that protocols aren't that different. I'm not sure we've ever gotten a wilder series of predictions. So thank you both for that. Aron, we want to go ask you for some career advice. You've had a really interesting career from going out in college, being an individual contributor at an early startup, all the way through the sale, all the way through healthcare, and now back into industrial, where you're the CTO of a now very quickly growing startup. If there are young, kind of early to middle career folks listening to this, and they're looking for some career advice, what sort of career advice would you give them?
Yeah, really quick, I would say on the software engineering piece, like that electrical engineering background, I think really helped me, right? It's amazing how many like CS majors will graduate and never work with threading or synchronization. Or I had one tell me that, memory management scared them. And I was like, well, that's like, you're doing memory management, whether you know it or not. Like, you should understand some of the lower
Ah,
level stuff, right? Like it
yeah,
helps. I think the pragmatic marketing course that I took early in my career to like look at product market fit, customer problems, like empathize with customers was really beneficial to me. A lot of really
yeah.
talented engineers spend a lot of time on the wrong problems or optimizing the wrong
Mhm,
parts, right? So that's helpful. And the last thing, like more recently, people, folks are afraid of AI taking over
mhm.
software engineering jobs. I think Vlad, you mentioned it's probably going to make really good software engineers even more valuable, and I would agree. So anyone young that's worried about that, I would say go learn, like leverage the tech. It's an advantage for you to come into an organization and understand how to use AI, to be more performant. Like that's your competitive advantage. Don't look at it as a threat.
Mhm. I think that's really good advice. Lots of people, engineers and otherwise, spend a lot of time building solutions for problems that don't exist, or perhaps solutions for problems that people are unwilling to pay for. It may exist, sometimes people aren't willing to pay for it. So, absolutely, I think that's interesting. Go become an engineer, focus on AI, or become a plumber. Again, as you said, Aaron, the world will always need more plumbers. As I was telling Vlad, my parents had to call someone out. They were charging like $180, $190 an hour in order to go try to solve a problem that they had already been unable to solve and were paid for it earlier. And I'm like, Vlad, we're in the wrong industry, or we need to
It's
charge more.
double
If
dip.
these
Yeah.
guys are making $180 or $190 an hour after they've already failed to solve the problem the first time, something is wrong. Something is terribly, terribly wrong. That
Yeah.
is awesome, Aaron. I know you've got a book recommendation for us.
Yeah, I was looking. There was one I read on like or PLC automation earlier on. I couldn't find it. It was good, but the another one that I have read back in like 2010. It's called Countdown to Zero Day. It's an old book.
Mhm.
Stuxnet Countdown to Zero Day. It's about a virus that I think now was proven to be the U.S. and Israel that attacked Iranian centrifuges
Mhm.
to help get in the way of their nuclear armament plans. But it's a really fascinating book. It doesn't focus so much on that, like the political side of it. It
Yep.
focuses more on it was a early virus targeted towards Siemens PLCs
Mhm.
with 0-day vulnerabilities, and it's really interesting how it was actually designed so when it infected the PLC, it would spit back data to the HMI to look like the process was fine, but under the
Mhm.
hood, it was messing with the cycle times in the process. So it's just a really fascinating book, and obviously a security conscious culture today even more so than back then, and it's just amazing to see if like someone's really focused on hacking something, the odds they can go to and like how effective
Oh
they can
yeah.
be. Yeah.
Absolutely. As I told Aaron, and for all of our not long time listeners, if you guys want to hear some absolutely terrifying predictions, go back to any of our October episodes. We've got like 12 or 15 of them up.
In the fall
All
would
of
be
our
perfect.
ICS cybersecurity professionals. If you ever want to be terrified of what the future is going to be, and just go to I'm going to be a plumber and live under a rock. Yeah, go listen to some of those future predictions. I feel like one after the other 2 years ago was one terrifying prediction after the other. So awesome. Thank you for that, Aaron. And then the last question for you is how can our listeners help? Who should reach out? Who do you want to connect with? Kind of your open platform for how can we help you? How can we help HighByte?
Yeah, so we're a startup, growing fast. I think if you're interested in technology, go to the website, check it out. You
Hmm.
can download it and play with HighByte and this whole
Hmm.
data contextualization thing for free.
Hmm.
We have like 2-hour demo, just like Ignition, so you do not
Yep.
have to talk to anybody from sales. You can go play with it and kind of learn at your own pace. Uh,
Sounds perfect to me.
right,
I was
and
going
but
to
if you
say
want to talk
this
with
is
someone
how we
from
know
sales,
HighByte
they're
is an engineering company is because you
engineering.
can get to their stuff without talking to someone.
Yep.
You can tell the difference between engineering driven companies and sales driven companies as to if you have to talk to people in order to get to the software. Absolutely, Aaron. This is awesome. If you guys haven't checked out the HighByte website, absolutely go ahead and check it out. Go give it a download. The last I looked, pricing and all of that was also visible. If you guys want to go take a look at that, I always appreciate it when we have a guest come on or the guest company has visible pricing. It makes all of our lives easier, especially if you can go download it and then go ask good questions as opposed to go sit through the painful download process on a team or screen sharing in order to attempt to go find some time to play with it. So, Aaron, This has been awesome. Thank you so much for this. Everyone, thank you for hanging out with Vlad and I. This has been the IIoT theme. If you guys have thoughts, questions, or comments, be sure to connect with Aron and follow HighByte, follow Vlad, myself, and Manufacturing Hub. If you guys are listening on podcast form, thanks. This is awesome. Live, we will not be here next week, but podcast form, we won't miss a week because we're a week or so behind in order to get all of these awesome episodes to you guys. Until next time, we'll talk.